So there she is. They are waving and saying hello. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. People may still be coming in, but let's get going. Welcome, everyone. I am Kimberly Dudick, the CEO and co-founder of the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies. I'm here today with Pipper's co-founder and CFO, Sophie Moon. And we are hosting these Tuesday talks to further the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies mission of bringing attention to underaddressed issues in Montana, letting you know some of the people working on them, and giving you the opportunity to learn how to get involved. You can also ask some questions during this that you want answered. These talks are recorded, and attendees can post questions in either the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer as many of these as possible at the end. We also have this recorded and released in a podcast format later if people are unable to meet now. And we are now having it televised also on MCAT, Missoula Community Access Television, channel 189 on 8:30s on Tuesday and 6:30 on Fridays. So if you don't get enough this time, you can always watch it again. We are thrilled to have with us today S.J. Howell. S.J. is co-director of Montana Women Vote. We are thrilled to have S.J. with us today, and I'm just going to turn it over and let S.J. introduce himself. So thank you for being with us today. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I love getting a chance to talk about what's happening in our work, and especially during the legislative session, what's happening at the legislature. As Kim said, I'm director of Montana Women Vote, and I'll talk a little bit about what that organization does and what kind of work we do. But mostly just want to say thanks for having me on. Shall I jump in to talk about Montana Women Vote?
Jump in. Tell us about Montana Women Vote and the work you're doing there.
Great, thank you. So Montana Women Vote is a statewide economic justice organization. We've been around for just over 20 years now. And we work on issues of economic justice with a gender and racial justice framework. And so what that means is we think about how people experience poverty, and also how the policies that work to address or end poverty impact women, kids, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBT folks, how they're impacted uniquely or differently by poverty and by the policies that address poverty. That's a little wonky, I know, but basically our organization was founded to think about low-income women and families and their experience in Montana, both in the civic sphere and in everyday life. And we do our work in three main ways. The first is community organizing and civic engagement. We do voter registration and get out the vote work. And we also do a lot of work to support people taking action in decision-making spaces, whether that's the legislature or city council. We work on policy change. So we work on a wide variety of issues. We'll talk a lot more about that in a few minutes. And then we do leadership development work. We have a great annual gathering, and during non-pandemic times, monthly gatherings to get together, to network, to build skills, and to really support one another in taking leadership over those decisions that impact our lives.
Well, I've been to your annual gathering a few times, and it's always great. So anyone who wants to go to that, I highly recommend it. It's always valuable to hear everything and also to meet people. So how did you become involved in the work you're doing?
Well, I'm a Montana kid. I grew up in Billings and went to public school in Billings and went to college here in Missoula and moved away for a while. I've always been involved in organizing and social justice work. I got involved in that work at a pretty young age, and ultimately wanted to come back and do work at home with my home communities. I think that Montana is a state with an incredible amount of potential. I love the way that Montanans look after one another and care for one another in their communities. And I think that that we have the ability to make change at the political level as well and make sure that Montana is a state where everybody has the resources and recognition they need to thrive. And that's why I do the work I do and why we do the work we do at Montana Women Vote.
So tell us about a little bit more about that. What are the problems that you're seeking to address right now, especially with the legislature in session?
Sure. Well, I'll take a quick step back and talk a little bit about how we got started. The sort of origin story of Montana Women Vote really had to do with low-income women not turning out to vote at the same rates as your average voter. And when folks dug into that, they really found that it's not an issue of apathy or disengagement. It's that there were real barriers to voting, and that included, concrete barriers like time off work or childcare or access to a car, but also barriers about access to information and access to understanding and participating in the conversations about who's on the ballot and the issues on the ballot and how those policies impact people's lives. And so, we're really looking at trying to connect and grapple with both of those problems, both the policies that impact low-income people and the way that poverty keeps low-income people out of decision-making spaces. And we try to sort of address those from both angles. So we want to change the kinds of policies that keep people in poverty and perpetuate poverty, but we also want to do that in a way where people's voices are heard and people have a chance to tell their story, and that decisions about low-income Montanans aren't being made in rooms where there are no low-income Montanans. So that's sort of the big picture. Drilling down specifically, we really work on a wide variety of issues. Access to healthcare has remained a core issue of ours for about 10 years now. And within that, Medicaid and Medicaid expansion, along with CHIP and Healthy Montana Kids, remain a really core piece of the work that we do. We also work on other safety net programs, everything from SNAP, which is food stamps, to things like paid sick days and paid family medical leave. We work a little bit on criminal justice reform because we recognize that our criminal legal system has really criminalized poverty to a pretty great extent. So a lot of folks are really caught up in the system for no real reason other than the fact that they're poor. And we'd like to see that change. And then we work on a variety of other issues, Indigenous justice and the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis, LGBT issues, reproductive rights. And then part of what ties all of these issues together is thinking about tax and revenue policy in our state budget and how we invest in or don't invest in our communities and the programs and services that families need. So that's a long list, but it is all remarkably interrelated once you start to dig into it.
So talk to us a little bit more about what you've been doing for the last 3 months. The legislature is halfway over, and I know this has been a big week there where they've been looking at the budget, but there's also a lot of other bills dealing with healthcare and some of the other issues you mentioned. So talk to us about what has the legislature been like and what's going on there that people should know about.
Well, that's a great question. I will say, first of all, there's a lot going on at the legislature. And I know you've heard from a number of other folks who've probably touched on lots of these issues. So I'll move through things fairly quickly. But if folks have questions or want me to go into more depth on any bills, let me know. I'm happy to do that. Like I said, one of our top issues is Medicaid and Medicaid expansion. And there's a couple bills that are really have a real potential impact on how Medicaid works in this state. One of those bills is SB 100, Senate Bill 100, This bill is called the Welfare Fraud Prevention Act. And for anyone who's not watching, I put air quotes around welfare fraud because this bill really isn't about fraud. It's a bill that creates a lot of really difficult and onerous eligibility verification systems. It requires the state to gather data on folks who are applying for Medicaid from a long list of different state databases, and to check that eligibility at least twice a year. This applies to Medicaid and Medicaid expansion, but it also applies to SNAP and the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP. And what we know about this bill is that it has the potential to create what's called churn. And churn is a policy term that means anyone who is disenrolled from a program and then re-enrolled within a 4-month time period. And a lot of times folks are churned on or off a program because their income changes just a little bit. You know, they pick up a couple extra shifts, or they get some overtime, or they get an unexpected gift from a relative. And all of a sudden, for 1 month, they're over the eligibility limit, the income limit, and they're disenrolled. And then the next month, they're back down to being eligible and they re-enroll. And as you can imagine, this is bad policy. It costs the state a fortune to keep track of all of that churn. And it's bad for folks who see interruptions in their health coverage. It's bad if you need a prescription, or if you're unlucky enough to have an accident or get sick while you happen to be without coverage. And SB 100 is estimated to cause about 7,000 people to churn every year. So that's a pretty big chunk of Montanans who are just going on and off of these programs for no real good reason. And it also estimates that several thousand folks will end up losing coverage altogether, whether because they are disenrolled and they never re-enroll, or because there's a problem with their eligibility that they can't fix. There's documentation that they're being asked for that they can't find, something like that. And so despite all of this, thousands and thousands of Montanans, including kids who are seeing their healthcare coverage interrupted, the bill says that it might find maybe 50 cases of fraud. So, you know, this isn't a bill about fraud. It's really a bill about making healthcare coverage and safety net services for low-income Montanans harder to access. It is being heard next week in the House Human Services Committee. And, you know, this is a bill, again, it would just have really negative impacts on low-income Montanans. So that's one of our top priorities, wanting to see that bill voted down. There's another bill. This bill actually hasn't been introduced, although we think it will be introduced any day now. So it has what's called an LC number, which is what a bill has before it gets a bill number. But you can still look it up or call or email and leave messages with the number. And that's LC 1192-1192. And this is another bill that does very similar things. It, it makes verification for Medicaid and CHIP a little bit harder. It requires the department to confirm people's eligibility before they have access to healthcare coverage. And, you know, one of the things that's really tricky about that is right now, if you are uninsured but eligible for Medicaid and you get into a car accident and are taken to a hospital, one of the things that hospital will do is help you enroll in Medicaid and make sure that your healthcare is covered, which is good for the hospital and of course good for you if you're uninsured. This bill would prohibit that being done. It would require that all of that eligibility verification work, which can take sometimes just a couple of days, but can take more time, depending on how backed up the department is, that all of that is done before any benefits are given out. So that and a number of other pretty harmful impacts in LC 1192. So those are two of our top healthcare bills that we're watching. I'll also just let folks know that the state budget does contain millions of dollars of cuts to Medicaid and to other programs for people living with disabilities and kids accessing healthcare services. So I think overall, there's just a lot of attacks on safety net services, and it's important for us to make sure that legislators are hearing from us that, those aren't Montana values, that we don't support making it harder for folks to get the care that they need, and that nobody should have to risk bankruptcy to be able to go see a doctor. We've gone through this as a state twice now, and both times we've passed Medicaid expansion because that's what Montana wants. We want to take care of our neighbors. So I'll stop there. That's a long chunk on healthcare. I'm happy to go into more depth on that. I want to just mention a couple other things.
Before you change, I want people to understand if that Medicaid expansion, that verification and the assistance that the hospitals are giving, if that is ceased, how can that negatively impact, especially small hospitals who depend on those funds coming to them, like in our small towns? Can they just absorb that, no problem? Or what is it going to do to some of those small hospitals possibly facing closure? Could you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So when folks access care at a hospital and they don't have health insurance or health coverage of any kind, there's two things that can happen. One is hospitals can aggressively go after collecting that money. People can be sent to collections. This is how folks end up in medical bankruptcy. But hospitals also know, when there's nothing to collect, it's not worth your time trying to collect bills from people who have no assets and no resources. So that money or that care is what's called uncompensated care. And uncompensated care is care that is provided and never paid for. Most hospitals have some room in their budget to cover uncompensated care. Some of it is charity care. Some of it is just unexpected care, uncompensated care that they absorb. But all hospitals have a bottom line, and especially rural hospitals and critical access care hospitals have really struggled pre-2015, really struggled with rising uncompensated care rates. So there's a couple things that happen when those levels of uncompensated care go up. One, hospitals can start charging more for services to everyone. So that means that those costs are passed on to all healthcare consumers. It means that our private health insurance rates go up because those insurers are paying more, and healthcare gets more expensive for everyone. Or hospitals go out of business and they close their doors. And in a lot of states around the country, we've seen lots and lots of small hospitals go out of business because they just can't keep up with levels of uncompensated care, and there just aren't there aren't enough customers to pass those costs on to. We've been really lucky in Montana that no hospitals have closed in the last 5 years, and I think that that's due in no small part to Medicaid expansion. In 2015, Montana's uninsured rate was right around 20%. So 1 in 5 Montanans had no health insurance. And I think hospitals were really feeling that. Now we're down to about 7%. And that's a big difference. And, that makes the difference not just for low-income folks who need to be able to see the doctor, but for all of us who want a healthcare system that works and healthcare that isn't out of control expensive.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that. Go ahead. Talk about more of the stuff you're working on.
I actually want to jump in here really quick because while we're on SB 100, there was a great question from one of our participants that just rolled in. And our participant is asking, is there any possibility that money from the AMER Relief Act can somehow mitigate the motivation for SB 100? This participant is going on to say otherwise they're not sure what else can be done, and maybe also looking for some more ways that participants can engage in the legislative process around this bill.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the American Relief Act, this is the COVID relief bill that just passed that, gave Montanans and all Americans stimulus checks, as well as gave a big chunk of money to each state. There are ways that money can be spent to address healthcare needs. And I do think that some of that will be done. There are also some contingencies to prevent states from disenrolling folks from Medicaid while the pandemic is still active. Unfortunately, SB 100 sort of works around those provisions. And so there's really nothing, without legislators choosing to use the American Relief Plan money to address healthcare needs. There's no way that bill will necessarily stop SB 100. Both things can move forward at the same time. But there are things to be done, and the best thing to do is to contact representatives, and specifically to contact the House Human Services Committee. If you call the switchboard at 444-4800 or go online and use the web form, you can leave a message for the entire committee all at once. And that's what I would recommend doing. The committee is the first group of House members who's going to hear the bill. And I think that's a really important point in this bill's travels that we can engage in. So that's what I would recommend, is either calling or emailing a message to the entire House Human Services Committee urging a no vote on SB 100. If it passes out of committee, then I would say, contacting House members before a floor vote is the next best thing.
All right, thank you. Thanks for telling everyone how to be more involved. And we want to give time for more questions from people. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and squeeze more information in there about other issues you're working on, so then we can have time for questions too.
Sure. I'll just highlight one more set of bills that I think are important. And these are tax cut bills. So SB 159 is an income tax bill, and SB 182 is what's called a tax cut trigger bill. These are both tax cut bills that have been brought at the request of the governor, and combined would give away nearly $90 million a year in state general fund revenue. The vast majority of that money would go to the wealthiest Montanans and to wealthy business owners. These are bills that really impact the state, not just right now, but for years to come, because this is nearly $90 million every year of revenue that's no longer coming into the state. So these, not only are these tax cut bills that are sort of fundamentally unfair, the wealthiest Montanans could see upwards of $3,000 a year in a tax cut, whereas your average Montanan making $40,000 a year might see $15 a year in a tax break. So, it's not going to impact working folks. It's surely not going to impact low-income Montanans who might see $1 or $5 more in their tax return. This is money that's going straight into the pockets of wealthy Montanans. And it is going to put our state budget into a pretty precarious situation. 2 years from now, when we come back together, we're going to see a hole in our revenue that's 150, $170 million. And there's not much for the legislature to do at that point but make budget cuts. So we're really concerned about these tax cuts. We think especially right now, especially after this last year that we've had, there's never a good time for tax cuts for the wealthy, in my opinion, but this is particularly a bad time. So, those bills, they're headed to the House floor in the next probably few weeks, 2 weeks probably. And I think that legislators should hear from us that these tax cuts are a giveaway for the wealthy and bad for your average Montanans. And the last thing I'll say on that is just that we did try to pass a couple progressive tax bills this year, an expansion of the earned income tax credit, which goes directly to, low-income working Montanans, and creation of a higher top income tax bracket so that wealthiest Montanans pay their fair share. And both of those bills were killed in committee, never even made it to the House floor. So, there's clearly a dichotomy happening in the legislature right now. And I'll stop there. I could talk for, all day long about what's happening in the session right now, but I'll stop there and see if folks have questions.
All right, well, I'd love to keep asking you questions, but let's go ahead and turn it over to our listeners. If you all have any questions, I know there's some been posted already, but please go ahead and start putting some in the chat box or through the Q&A, and let's ask SJ our questions, and you can get your answers now. So I'll turn it over to Sophie. Go ahead, Sophie, you can go ahead with the questions. Thanks,
Kim. So the first question is kind of off the topic that we've been discussing earlier. So it'll be interesting to see what you think. This participant asks, I'm a treasurer for the newly formed Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority. Our objective is restoration of frequent passenger rail transportation through the heart of Montana. What way would intercity passenger rail help low-income and marginalized Montanans?
Oh, I love that question. Also, that's not an area of expertise that I really have. I think the more public transportation options we have, the better for all Montanans, but especially for low-income Montanans who might not have privately owned cars or other transportation options. But beyond that, if anybody else has an answer on that, I'd love to hear it. I love the effort and definitely support it, but that's outside of my wheelhouse. Thanks for the question.
So the next question that we have here is asking about if Montana Women Vote has any efforts to recruit candidates to run in 2022.
Another great question. So we are a nonpartisan organization, so we really don't do any candidate recruitment, but we do offer some real basic skills building and education about how to run for office that is available to anyone. And we do that through our Women's Policy Leadership Institute, our annual conference, and other ways. And I think there are some great candidate recruiting efforts, both done by political parties and by other organizations that, like Carol's List is a great example that I would point people toward.
Great. And this next question is just a clarification. This person is asking, what are the tax bill numbers that you had referenced earlier?
So SB 159 is an income tax cut for the wealthiest Montanans. And SB 182 is a tax cut trigger bill, which would trigger additional tax cuts down the road if there's a certain amount of money in our rainy day fund.
Great, thank you. Those are currently all the questions we have right now. As we continue with the conversation, I hope people will keep throwing them in. And there is a comment here just saying that your testimony is super factual and helpful. So I hope that you take that to heart while we continue on today. So if folks have more questions as we continue on, throw them in and I'll go ahead and interrupt as I can.
Great. Thanks, Sophie. I actually saw one from earlier that, having been a Missoula representative before, I'd like to ask SJ this one. So this person said that contacting my Missoula rep doesn't do much because they're like-minded Democrats like me. Is this the most effective way to really have an impact? And that kind of broadens it. Like, what is your opinion in that kind of a situation? What should somebody do to really be involved?
So that's a great question. And we get that question a lot. And I would say a couple things. One, I think it's actually really helpful to send messages to your representative. And Kim, you can weigh in on this if you'd like. I think it's a hard time to be an elected official right now, and knowing that constituents are watching and have their back actually goes a long way. I also think I mentioned earlier sending messages to an entire committee. So that's a way that you can weigh in on a bill to the committee of legislators that's about to grapple with it. And, it's helpful if one of those representatives is your representative, but not necessary. And I think it's really useful to send messages to an entire committee. I think there are some legislators that will discount messages from folks who don't live in their district, and that's a shame. But I still think that when legislators have a bill before them and they get a bunch of messages, they know that people are paying attention, and they know this is an issue that Montanans understand and care about. And I think that one of the challenges with our legislature is that it's fast paced. It only happens once every other year. And there's a lot of stuff that happens in the Capitol building that flies under the radar. And I think one of our jobs is just to let legislators know we're watching. And even if you're not a constituent, you can still say, this isn't part of my Montana values, or, we're paying attention to the way you vote on this issue, especially again at that committee level. So I would recommend doing that. And then the other thing that I think is useful, although it's a little bit harder and not quite as immediately satisfying, but writing letters to the editor actually is really important. And, if you fire off a letter to the editor every couple weeks on the issues that you care the most about, legislators do read letters to the editor. Again, it's part of showing that we're paying attention and that these issues are important to us. So those are my suggestions. And then, Kim, as a former legislator, I'd welcome your input on that too.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and especially people don't really think about that, but the continual letters to the editor is really a big deal for showing what the climate is in Montana and what we care about. And I also just have to say that there are times when you get maybe 400 emails or messages about a bill from all over Montana, and people talk about it. So even if you aren't that person's constituent, it matters. So please go ahead. It's really easy to send those emails or to leave those messages. There's also a new cool thing that the Legislative Services, who is the staff for the legislators, has started, where you can actually see how many messages have been left for different bills. And so when you're actually looking, that's part of now the record, and it's easily accessible online. I'm not sure, I don't recall exactly where, but you can access it now through the Legislative Services, which is a big deal because it shows then if things, pass that people are strongly opposed to, it's important to create that record. So I fully agree with everything you said there.
Great.
All right. So I don't see any other questions coming. Sophie, do you?
No, not yet. But if people do have more questions as we continue, I'll just hop in.
Awesome. Great. We have a couple minutes. One thing before we go kind of to the wrap up, I was hoping you could expand on this because I don't think people quite understand, especially just the general voting electorate out there who's just trying to pay their bills and take care of their families and maybe go on a vacation. What does it mean when we say tax breaks for the wealthy? Because many people think, hey, it's a tax cut. That sounds great. And they're getting $3,000, but what's the big deal? Because how does that really impact my life? So could you kind of connect those dots for when that person who makes, $1 million a year receives maybe a $3,000 tax cut and you get a $15 one, what does that really mean to the average person? What is the end result of that?
That's a great question. So the important part about understanding tax cuts is that in order to build a budget and pay for the things that we care about, Montana collects revenue through taxes. And the biggest source of revenue in Montana is income tax. And that's in part because we don't have a sales tax, a statewide sales tax. And in part because we're not a sort of big business state, and our corporate taxes are very low. So income tax that we all pay is how we build what's called our general fund. And the general fund is what we use every 2 years to build a budget. And that budget pays for things that are important to us. It pays for, teachers for our kids. It pays for the sort of safety net programs that I've been talking about. So when somebody ends up in a financial crisis, if they need SNAP to put food on the table or Medicaid to be able to see the doctor, it pays for really important programs for people with disabilities, people with mental health or substance use disorder issues, for folks to be able to access the care that they need. And it pays for public safety and clean air and water monitoring, and basically all the things that make our state run. And when we give those tax cuts to the wealthy, that money doesn't come back into our economy. Folks will say that there's the trickle-down effect, and we all know by now the trickle-down effect doesn't exist. That money goes into the stock market. That money goes into wealthy people's retirement funds. We never see it again. And legislators are left with a hole in the general fund that is equivalent to that amount of money that we've given away. And so we pay teachers less, we cut programs for low-income folks, we don't invest in things like pre-kindergarten or conservation programs. We do less for everybody else in the state. And that in turn, it has a cycle effect. It makes our state harder to live in. So young folks leave, after they grow up, they move to Seattle or they move to Denver. It makes it harder to recruit business owners and people like doctors and lawyers who need to come in and work specialty jobs here. It makes everybody's lives just a little bit harder. And again, the benefit to those wealthy folks is really just to the wealthy folks. It's not coming back into the state in any measurable way. So I hope that answers your question, Kim. I do think that it's hard really to put your finger on it, but it is something that we're all going to feel.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think it's important for people to understand how everything is interconnected and that has a long-term impact on us here.
Yeah.
We did get some more listener questions, so I'm going to go ahead and hop in just with a few here. So one of them is going back to our conversation earlier about contacting legislators and being a part of the legislative process. And this participant is asking, is it okay and effective to contact the representative who authored a bill?
Yes. I will just say it's always okay to contact a representative. Any representative, even if they're not your representative. And if somebody, including that representative, tells you otherwise, that's wrong and that's not okay. Authors of a bill, especially if it's a bill that you're trying to kill, are usually not the most effective target because, if they are authoring the bill, they probably care about it and want to see it pass. But, again, committee members, or if you have questions for an author of a bill, like what does this bill do, or why are you bringing it, or what are you hoping to see change with this bill? That kind of thing is great, and I would always recommend that.
So this one came in as a comment, but I'm going to move it into a question because I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. This participant says, so this week I've listened to legislative updates from Forward Montana, Montana State Democratic Party, Montana Poor People Campaign, and your organization, all of which are really informative and helpful. But with a supermajority in the legislature, there seems little opportunity to change. This person goes on to say, I think that we need some more like longer term planning and vision. And I wonder, what is your pulse on whether that longer term planning and vision is happening, who's involved, and how maybe normal people who aren't so involved in the political world can be helpful or engage in that work?
I think that's a really good question and a really fair question. And I will just acknowledge that the legislative session is a very immediate short-term thing that we focus our energy on. And there's not a lot of forward looking during the session, and that's just the nature of the beast. I will say though, that one of the things that we care a lot about is actually having conversations like this where we make the connections between the bills that are being passed and what people experience in their life, because that's how folks, one, come to understand and dig in a little bit more to the political process, and also really start to think about who they're voting for and why. And I would venture to guess that everybody who's joining us today is politically engaged and understands how policy impacts people's lives. But I don't think that every Montanan has, the luxury of the time and access to information necessarily to have these conversations. And so that's part of what we have to do. We have to go out and meet people where they're at and have these conversations. I think that longer term, we do have to think about making a case for government as a force for good. I think that in this state and in this country, there's been a lot of the opposite of that. And I think we need to say we can and should use government as a vehicle for investing in communities and taking care of our neighbors and making sure our families can thrive. And then we have to follow through on that. And we have to say, here's how we're doing it, and here's how we want to do it. And I know that's easier said than done, but I think that's the easiest thing that I can say in a short period of time. I will say that everyone I know who does this kind of work is thinking about the future. We're thinking about 2022 and 2024, and we're thinking about what's ahead and how we're going to work to undo some of the harm that's being caused in this session and continue to build a Montana that works for all of us. So even though we might not be having those conversations right now during the session, they're definitely on our mind. And I look forward to seeing all of those conversations unfold in the next few months.
Well, thank you for that, for your answers, and for all the work you're doing. We're going to wrap things up now with our final 4 questions, which are just a little bit more fun, intended to let people get to know you a little more. So what is a podcast that you're listening to right now you'd recommend to others?
I have been listening to a podcast called Maintenance Phase. It's about, it's debunking diet culture and food myths and talking about fat phobia. And it's very funny and very engaging, and I recommend it wholeheartedly. It's called Maintenance Phase.
Phase? Never heard of it. That sounds like a great one. Who's your favorite singer?
Impossible to choose. I looked at that question for a long time. Right now I'm listening to a new album by Valerie June. She's amazing, but there's no way to pick a favorite for me.
Good enough. What's your favorite place to go in Montana?
Beartooth Mountains. That's an easy one.
It's beautiful. How about what's the best advice you were ever given?
I'm notoriously bad at taking advice, but someone once said, sometimes plan and sometimes wing it. And I've really taken that one to heart.
I like that. I like it. Well, thank you so much for the work you're doing, and thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks. Oh, hey, what's your contact information if people would like to reach out to you?
So you can find the organization at montanawomenvote.org, and you can find me at howell@montanawomenvote.org. That's my email address, and there's more contact info on our webpage.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And to everyone who's listening today, thanks for listening. Thanks for your questions. We're hosting these talks to provide an opportunity for people to hear about different organizations and people in our state and to learn how they can become involved in shaping their communities. We heard a lot of that good stuff today. So thank you so much, SJ.
Thank you.
You can reach out to the Public Policy Institute of the Rockies on Facebook at Public Policy Institute of the Rockies, Twitter at Policy Rockies, Instagram at PPI of the Rockies, and shoot us an email at info@pipper.org. And if you want to listen to this again or any of our past talks, you can find us on Tuesday Talks on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And we're going to keep these conversations going. Thank you all, and let's keep moving Montana forward together. Thanks a lot.